When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent in 1918, Britain was a nation filled with a strange mixture of hope and exhaustion. The country had won the war, but the cost had been immense. Soldiers returned home to a land they had been promised would be a home fit for heroes. But the reality was far more complicated. For a brief moment, it seemed like the promises might come true. There was a short-lived economic boom, a surge in demand for goods that had been scarce during the long years of conflict. Factories were busy and jobs were plentiful, which gave the trade unions a powerful voice. They had grown strong during the war, working with the government to keep production going, and now their membership was at an all-time high. However, beneath this shiny surface of post-war prosperity, deep-seated problems were beginning to fester. The very industries that had once made Britain the workshop of the world, coal, steel, shipbuilding and textiles, were now facing serious challenges. They had been pushed to their limits during the war and were now outdated and struggling to compete with newer, more efficient industries in America and Japan. The brief boom soon turned to bust. As international demand for British goods fell, factories started to close, and the spectre of unemployment, which had been banished during the war, returned with a vengeance, casting a long shadow over the industrial heartlands of the North, Scotland, and Wales. This economic turmoil was mirrored by a dramatic shift in the political landscape. The old certainties were disappearing. The Liberal Party, which had dominated British politics for a generation, was tearing itself apart. In its place, a new force was rising, the Labour Party. For the first time, Labour represented a genuine alternative for working people, a party born out of the trade union movement itself. It promised a different kind of society, one that would protect workers from the harsh winds of the free market. In 1924, Ramsay MacDonald formed the very first, albeit short-lived, Labour government. This political change gave millions of workers a sense of newfound power and expectation, believing that Parliament could now be an instrument for their advancement. The grim reality for many, however, was not one of political power but of daily struggle. The decline of Britain's staple industries created vast pockets of long-term unemployment. In towns like Jarrow on Tyneside, the closure of the local shipyard meant that almost the entire male population was out of work. This wasn't just a temporary setback, it was a structural collapse that tore the heart out of entire communities. Families who had relied on the mines or the mills for generations suddenly found themselves with no prospects and no hope. The government's response, the dreaded means test, was often seen as humiliating and inadequate, forcing families to sell their possessions just to receive a pittance of support. This widespread hardship created a fertile ground for social and industrial unrest. Despite the economic downturn and the terrifying rise in unemployment, the spirit of the trade union movement was far from broken. In fact, the immediate post-war years were some of the most militant in British history. In 1919, a wave of major strikes swept the country, involving railway workers, miners, and even the police. These weren't just disputes over pay. They were a powerful assertion of working-class strength. Inspired in part by the dramatic events of the Russian Revolution of 1917, many workers believed that a fundamental change in society was not just possible, but imminent. The creation of the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1920, though small, added a new, more radical voice to the political debate, calling for the complete overthrow of the capitalist system. This new mood of militancy led to significant changes within the trade union movement itself. The Trades Union Congress, or TUC, the umbrella body for the unions, reorganized itself to become a more powerful and coordinated force. It created a general council, a sort of workers' cabinet, which was designed to direct strategy and provide stronger leadership across the entire movement. This was a direct response to the feeling that individual unions were too easily defeated when they fought their battles alone. The idea was to create a united front, capable of taking on not just individual employers but the government itself. This new structure would soon be put to the ultimate test. The simmering tensions between the unions and the government finally boiled over in 1926. The flashpoint was the coal industry, where mine owners, facing falling profits, demanded that miners accept longer hours and lower pay. The miners, famously led by the uncompromising A.J. Cook, refused, declaring, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." In a historic act of solidarity, the TUC called for a general strike to support the miners. For 9 dramatic days in May, the country ground to a halt. Transport workers, printers, dockers, and steelworkers all walked out in an unprecedented show of unity. It felt to many as if Britain was on the brink of revolution. Ultimately, however, the general strike ended in defeat. The government, led by Stanley Baldwin, had been preparing for such a confrontation for months. It used volunteers to keep essential services running and controlled the narrative through its own newspaper, the British Gazette. The TUC leadership, fearing the strike was spiralling out of their control and into outright revolution, called it off after 9 days, leaving the miners to fight on alone for another 6 bitter months before they were eventually starved back to work. The defeat was a crushing blow. The government passed the Punitive Trade Disputes Act of 1927, which made sympathetic strikes illegal. Union membership, which had peaked at over 8 million in 1920, plummeted, and the momentum of the movement was lost for a generation. Even in the face of defeat and economic depression, the struggle for workers' rights continued, often taking new and creative forms at a local level. One of the most famous examples of this was the Poplarism movement in the East End of London. In 1921, the Labour-controlled council in the poor borough of Poplar, led by the charismatic George Lansbury, took a brave stand. Faced with mass unemployment and poverty in their community, they refused to levy the high rates demanded by London's central authorities. Instead, they decided to use the money to provide more generous relief payments to the unemployed than the law allowed, a policy of work or full maintenance. This was direct defiance of the government. The government's response was swift and severe. 30 Poplar councillors, including 6 women, were arrested and sent to prison for contempt of court. However, their imprisonment turned them into working-class heroes and martyrs. Support for their cause grew across the country, with other councils threatening to follow their lead. The slogan, "Better to break the law than to break the poor," resonated deeply with a public weary of hardship. In the end, the government was forced to back down. It passed a new law that helped to equalize the financial burden between rich and poor boroughs. Poplarism became a powerful symbol of how determined local action could successfully challenge central government and achieve real improvements for ordinary people. By the 1930s, a new and sinister threat had emerged on the streets of Britain: fascism. Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, with their black-shirted thugs, attempted to gain a foothold, particularly in areas with large Jewish or immigrant populations like London's East End. The trade unions were at the forefront of the opposition. They saw fascism for what it was, a mortal enemy of the labour movement, which sought to crush unions and destroy every democratic freedom workers had fought for. Union leaders and activists organised counter-demonstrations and actively campaigned to expose the violent and racist nature of Mosley's ideology. This anti-fascist struggle came to a dramatic head on the 4th of October 1936 at the famous Battle of Cable Street. Mosley planned to march thousands of his black shirts through the heart of the Jewish community in the East End. In response, an incredible coalition of trade unionists, Jewish residents, communists, socialists, and Irish dockers came together to stop them. They built barricades and blocked the streets, chanting the Spanish Civil War slogan, "They shall not pass." The police tried to clear a path for the fascists, but the crowd of anti-fascists was too large and too determined. After hours of clashes, the police were forced to tell Mosley to call off his march. It was a humiliating defeat for the British Union of Fascists, and a tremendous victory for working-class unity and anti-fascist solidarity. The interwar period was a time of significant change for women workers, though progress was often slow and fraught with difficulty. During the First World War, hundreds of thousands of women had entered the workforce, taking on jobs in munitions factories and transport that had previously been reserved for men. This experience gave many women a new sense of economic independence and a taste for union organization. After the war, however, there was enormous pressure on women to give up their jobs to the returning soldiers. Many were pushed back into traditional low-paid female employment in domestic service, textiles, and clerical work, or out of the workforce altogether. Despite this restoration of pre-war practices, the number of women in trade unions remained significantly higher than it had been before 1914. By 1920, over 1 million women were union members. However, they often faced a contradictory attitude from the male-dominated union movement. While the TUC officially supported the principle of equal pay for equal work, many individual unions and their male members were hostile. They feared that women were a source of cheap labor that could be used by employers to undercut men's wages and working conditions. This suspicion often meant that women's specific concerns were sidelined and their voices were not always heard in the corridors of union power. The TUC did, however, make some important efforts to better represent its female members. A separate women's group was established within the TUC, and from 1921, 2 seats on the powerful General Council were reserved specifically for women. This ensured that a female perspective was, at least formally, included at the highest level of decision-making. Pioneering women trade unionists like Margaret Bondfield, who would go on to become Britain's first female cabinet minister, and Mary MacArthur of the National Federation of Women Workers, fought tirelessly to champion the cause of women's rights within the wider labour movement, campaigning on issues like pay, working hours, and maternity rights. Throughout the difficult years of the 1920s and 1930s, the trade unions, for all their flaws and internal divisions, remained a vital line of defence for working people. In an era of mass unemployment and government indifference, they provided a crucial safety net. They ran welfare schemes for their unemployed members, offered legal advice, and continued to fight for better pay and safer conditions in the workplace. Even when they couldn't win major national victories like the general strike, they could and did make a real difference to the daily lives of millions. They were a beacon of collective strength and human dignity in a period of profound economic hardship and political uncertainty, laying the groundwork for the post-war welfare state to come.